Hello, everyone. I'm Anna. Thanks for really fascinating insights, all of you. My question is mostly to Luke and Ilkin, but all welcome to respond. I'm a futurist, so I was particularly interested in your work and very happy to see your work using simulations and scenarios. And I'm really just keen to hear more about how you support people in your processes to experience multiple possible scenarios. You mentioned use of VR, and whether you do also any work to monitor the impact of those experiences on their perspectives, how whether or not that changes minds or opens opportunities for dialogue. And also I just thought I might share, so I'm running a futures workshop this afternoon, which I think could be quite useful in exploring that trade-off that you mentioned, Luke, and just also showcasing how futures methodologies can support reframing of narrative and dialogue. Okay, thank you so much.
My question's for Emily. So that was really great seeing all the differences between the languages. I guess I'm still noodling over like the normative question, like, so what should, or how should we decide like what an LLM should say or what our search results should say about, I don't know, who owns what islands in the South China Sea, or like, I'm still not sure, like, how do we resolve that? Like, how do we, if you told me the right answer, I could tell you, I could probably come up with some technical solution, but how do you figure out what's the right answer? Like, what should the thing actually say? And I'm just curious if you've thought about that.
Hi, my name is Elaine Pratley. I was interested to learn, Adam, about your data. You said it's culturally fluid in terms of the translation sometimes and how it interprets data. How about across time? Because conflict over time can be reinterpreted or historical memory can change. And so in terms of your data, is there a flexibility for that, for people to come back to the data and reimagine what they're seeing later on?
So to the first question, the motivation for this work is within an ongoing project trying to sort of build common ground among peace builders in Israel, Palestine, which is entirely online through a platform called Remesh, which you might have heard of. To be honest, my involvement with that is more on the sort of data analysis side, and the project has less specific envisaging of future scenarios. It's as much as trying to elicit hopes and values for the future. I'm happy to talk more about that offline, but I think the evaluation of that process that has happened so far is, and asking people who've been involved in it for their feedback. For the most part, I've found it quite validating, so that the platform will reflect back to people sort of what percentage of other people agreed with the things that they put forward into the platform. And I think it's very rare for people to get that kind of feedback, and they might feel like they're putting out a really unpopular opinion, but then they get back that some sizable chunk of people agreed with them. I think that's, the feedback about that particular aspect has been positive.
Yeah, I think there's a question for you, Emily. And then...
yeah, that is a very interesting question. And I think, in a sense, maybe we can think about it as a kind of a spectrum, where in the model cards or report cards of LLMs, it's very clear that there is a normative question in the sense that large language models, just like social media platforms, have to come to decide what can and cannot be said with regards to the absolutely unacceptable prompt. So that's a question of moderation. So there are a number of things that LLMs will refuse to say at all costs. And then on the other end of that spectrum, there is a question of controversiality. So contested issues like territorial disputes or a number of other things. And in that sense, I think that the question becomes more interesting, because if the LLM loses legitimacy in choosing one side or the other of a contested issue, or even in describing the extent to which or how that is a contested issue in a number of different ways. It does not reflect the multiplicity of voices that constitute its training data set. So one interesting way that could maybe advance that, in the same way that bridge building ranking algorithms in search or other places do, is maybe that LLMs, when they're prompted in chat interfaces, can do exactly that. So reflect the different ways in which not only that is a contested issue, but also the different voices that are involved in that contested issue. And I think then the question becomes, how can you facilitate consensus building in there, right, in a number of other design or other ways.
Adam.
There we go. Yeah, and if I understand your question correctly, you're asking how we look at our data, how it moves through time, and how it can change through time. There's a couple of interesting things about that, with particularly with the backend that we've transitioned to. What it allows us to do is we can see how individual categories that we code these peace agreements into diffuse through time. So we can say, like, from the start of a pre-negotiation process, we can apply the same that same methodology to that, look at it in the peace agreement, and then see how that issue diffuses through some of the implementation documents that come from that. And so we can really see how these different issues within peace agreements follow from the initial stages all the way into potentially even a constitution if a peace agreement goes that far. Another way that we use our data to look at sort of the effect of time, and this is a visualization we use a lot, is we use the PAX data to look at the different stages of peace agreements over time, and we sort of look at it as say maybe the pre-negotiation is the first step in a peace agreement, all the way up to, say, the development of a constitution. And ideally what you would see is this line over time that goes from here up to here, pre-negotiation all the way up to constitution. But what we show people all the time is what it really is these squiggly lines going everywhere, and that these peace processes are in fact very messy over time. They go back and forth, they break down, they reform. They're very complex and they're very fragmented. And I don't know if it sounds obvious or not, but it still surprises, I think, a lot of people in high-level diplomatic circles who still live in that world of the comprehensive agreement post-1990 to see this, to see that we now live in this very fragmented, very complicated peacemaking process that happens over time. And another thing that this new backend lets us do is it lets us look at how we are coding agreements and using our own data to train that, see, are we missing anything? Or are there new issues that are appearing in peace agreements over time that maybe we should be coding for? So that's another benefit of that as well. I hope that answered your question. I barely know where I am right now because of the jet lag, but hopefully that answers your question.
All right, thank you. We can take another round of questions. I know there was a question there. And one here. And then one here. Okay.
Thanks very much. Ravi actually kind of asked the question I was thinking about, but I think it's a really fantastic panel. I really thank Ilkin for having said the problem is not, how did you say it? The data is real, but it is one-sided. So that gets us past this. It's not about fact-checking and hate speech and lies. It's about, as Emily's presentation then goes further. So Emily's already kind of answered. I mean, you don't just want mush, because in the English language stuff, what seems to happen is the large language models just churn back something saying, oh, that's all very complicated, which doesn't really get you much further. And it's almost more interesting to see the small languages actually say it clearly. It's this, which helps. And so I think that I would like to ask Lindsay actually on that basis, this kind of question of like peace mediators, that's their métier, that's their job. is to reframe and give something back which tells both parties something which moves them forward, and not just give them, oh, that's all very interesting. So Lindsay, you said, and I didn't quite get how you put it, that in the budget controversy, you actually managed to do digital mediation. I'd just like you to be able to come back to us and say, what exactly, from your perspective, do you mean by digital mediation? Thank you.
There's a question here as well.
Yeah, the question relates to the media and how it's influencing the narratives, mainly what Emily and Luke talk about today. In the recent Palestinian and Israeli conflict, largely the social media influencers that are supporting the Palestinian voices were restricted. How will this influence later the narratives of this history, as it gives more advantage on those who are supporting the Israeli conflicts? For example, ChatGPT, Wikipedia, and all are recording what's said on the social media and the digital media. Okay.
And then,
Thank you very much. My question is for Emily. You spoke a lot about large language models, and I was really thinking about this concept of jailbreaking large language models, and does it help to amplify the bias, or that concept of pushing further a large language model to reveal something that probably it has been instructed not to, like giving an answer about a particular topic like manufacturing bombs? How does that affect the user of this large language models if they can actually jailbreak and make them say things that they were not programmed to say?
Thank you so much for the question. So as we realized from most conversations, when it came to mediation, it used to be like a face-to-face situation where people would sit down, or parties would meet, or there's someone who will be conducting the process. But now, with technology and the way it's become so fast-paced, so it's become easier for me. Digital mediation is now when we use technology, or when technology is involved in the process. So like the example I gave about leaders not wanting to meet to talk for whatever reason, but then they were able to speak in Zoom meetings, which they felt more comfortable in. So that's what I mean when it comes to digital mediation. I hope I've answered the question.
I'm sorry, I'll admit I heard the tail end of your question, but it was a little difficult to hear the first part of it. Would you mind repeating?
The first part, it relates to, for example, how the digital media is influencing the narratives of our communities later. For example, the Israeli conflict, mainly the social media content that are supporting the voice of the Palestinian conflict were restricted. And all this is condolences to the families of the leaders killed, Hamas leaders that are killed. Through this narrative, how it will influence the future of this history. For example, our future generations will look back to the digital media like Wikipedia, ChatGPT, and so on. It will report what is already said in that areas. That is mainly, for example, most of the Twitter and Facebook contents were largely covered by those who are supporting the Israeli side. Mainly, or largely the Palestinian supporting voices were restricted or limited. So how will this influence in the future of the Wikipedia and the data that we will then on this narrative? For example, in the presentation of Emily, it shows that what's writing on the issue that relates to the border of China like this and genocide like this. So it may report to documentation that's far foreign for the Israelis, as long as the Palestinian information were restricted. Thank you.
I can answer from sort of the perspective of my research, which is mostly on how recommender systems on social media impact conflict dynamics. And so there's pretty good evidence that optimizing for engagement and just people spending time on platforms, that tends to disproportionately surface stuff which is sort of inflammatory or divisive. And that's not spinning any particular narrative with respect to one side of a conflict, but it does sort of raise the heat. It's very difficult to sort of pinpoint causal causes and effects in like the context of social media, where there's complex interplays between different aspects of the platform design and the algorithm used and how people react and what they post and so on. But I think generally it does tend to sort of favor inflammatory stuff, and that has led to an incentive for media organizations over the last 2 decades or whatever to produce stuff which caters to those incentives and is more sort of inflammatory or attention grabbing than they would otherwise be inclined to make content. And I haven't seen any work on this, but most language models are trained on content on the internet, which has been produced under the incentives of social media and being distributed, at least for news media organizations, to a large extent through social media. So it would be really interesting to see how those sort of social media dynamics have influenced the training data pool of large language models.
Yeah, but about the question of jailbreaking. So I think the direct answer as to what happens when a model is jailbroken is that it says everything it's not supposed to say. So if the training data is relatively good or as rich as it is, for example, in English, it might also say very, let's say, politically correct things or acceptable things, right? If your prompt touches upon that. Other times, it might not. And I think this is a very interesting question in the sense that it also provocatively, it makes us think about the extent to which LLMs should show their true nature. So the extent to which they should actually say the things or show that they're trying to work through the things that they're not supposed to say. And in a sense, it's also a question about interface design. And this is also something that Guy mentioned earlier. So how exactly can LLMs show users the way that they mash up all this different training data into the little snippet of text that they eventually show, post-moderation, post-fine-tuning, everything? How does it show the way that it goes through deliberating what it should or should not say? And how exactly can we include, let's say, consensus building or other peace building strategies as part of that procedure? How do we make that transparent? I think that is a path to be taken when it comes to interface design and interacting with LLMs. And I think that the question as to how to integrate peace building as part of, let's say, mashing up training data is an interesting one that we're beginning to approach.
All right, thank you so much. I think just because of time, we're going to stop there with the questions. But just quickly, with 1 minute, if there's anything we want everybody to take away from your session, kindly just say it and then wrap up with 1 minute. So.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing I want people to take away from the session is ultimately the design process itself needs to be open to everyone. I think that involves people who traditionally don't involve themselves in supposed tech matters, who find it's not their domain, should definitely be involved. We need more people like that involved in these design processes, and for the people who are designing these things as well. If it's not easy to be involved in the design process, then something needs to change. I think that this needs to be. I think one more thing just to say is that this idea of interoperability that we've been talking about, or how well these data sets communicate with each other, I would argue that maybe it needs to take it one step further and be able to communicate with other ways of telling stories from local communities. Like there's a piece of artwork that I saw in there in the room that this surreal piece of artwork that talks about someone's individual experiences. And that's a very interesting and complex way to represent data, which I think is something that maybe needs to be included when we talk about data.
For me, I would say that we should not lose. Someone spoke about the people factor. So even if, like right now, things have moved online, we can still complement when it comes to mediation the physical meetings, the physical mediation processes with the digital. And also, there are always other avenues. There are also always other ways by which mediation can happen. So it shouldn't get stuck or stop at a point because people can't meet, or we should look for other spaces where these processes can actually happen.
I guess I talked about one particular trade-off, but more generally, I think a useful framework for thinking about what technology can do to help in these kinds of contexts is to help with trade-offs. So like another example would be voting. Normally there's a trade-off between how many people you can involve in a collective decision-making process and the depth with which they're involved. You can imagine sort of interfaces or affordances that use language model type technologies to involve a large group of people, but also to some substantive depth. There's lots of other examples like that. So I would encourage people to just think about when you're deploying technologies, what sort of possible ways of escaping existing trade-offs do they offer?
Well, to me, I think one interesting takeaway is when it comes to conflict-aware technical design is the ways that we have so far been demonstrating and the ways in which Build Up as a conference demonstrates very well in general and will do throughout the state, the many ways in which we can imagine the question of operationalization. So the question of how to integrate and operationalize peace building strategies into technical design. And that essentially it's a very particular way of thinking. And in and of itself, I think it is a discipline. It could be a discipline. It could be a master's program if you want it. So it's how is it that you combine certain strategies or practices or even philosophies as to how to facilitate mediation into such a particular specific thing as technical design development, the ways that we think about how an algorithm works, or the way that we think into how a particular AI works and how we make it. And that question to me is a very plural question. There is no way, I think, as we have already demonstrated, there is a plurality of ways or a plurality of strategies for a plurality of contexts or languages and so on. And in a sense, I think, I think that is the value of deliberating how exactly we operationalize and implement our values into technology.
So I think that I have to say that we shouldn't be afraid of the technology, and every time of the period in history. So when it comes to our life, the new technologies, new approach, so we are a bit hesitant about that. But I think that technologies are for being our lives more easier than it is. So it's the same for peace building as well. Like there was lots of challenging parts need to be improved. But still, like, when I compare our activities in 10 years or 5 or 10 years ago, so now they bring more space to us to work on it. So, for example, like, if you don't have a technology, probably all activities will stop during the COVID. So all peace building activities we should stop during this kind of pandemics or during the war, etc., when the real face-to-face communication stopped. So actually, like, yes, there is a part that's challenging and need to improve, but still it is for us, and we have to use it more a rational way to get peace building activities easier and more accessible, more wider. And the second thing is that when we improve that kind of technologies, we have to think it is technology, but it has to be human-centered like technologies. That human sense is very should be in the center of this. applications, there's platforms, etc., that are more accessible for all, and every people can use it, and also they have to access these kind of technologies. And if we can think about before we design these technologies, like making human-centric, so there was no need to be worried about that or just create these kind of technologies. Yes, thank you for session, and thank you for moderation this session.
Thank you very much, and a round of applause to this Gareth. Amazing. Thank you.